The sun over the Vance Ranch was a merciless thing, a brassy eye in a bleached blue sky that had forgotten the meaning of rain. It had been staring down for 3 months, baking the life from the land until the earth gave up and split open in a web of deep, thirsty cracks. The creek was a ghost of its former self, a dry, rocky scar winding through pastures of brittle, yellowed grass. Dust devils, lean and hungry, waltzed across the plains, spinning tales of ruin that mirrored the family's own. From the shade of the porch, Ilara Vance, Ellie to those few who knew her, worked a needle and thread through a brittle leather harness. The strap was as cracked and fragile as her family's hope. Each pull of the waxed thread was a small, defiant act against the decay that surrounded her. Her thoughts were as troubled as the landscape. She could feel the ranch groaning under the weight of the drought, the way a good horse groans under a saddle that does not fit. She saw it in the gaunt frames of their cattle, their ribs like washboards under dusty hides, their lowing a thin, mournful sound that carried on the hot wind. She saw it in the grim set of her father's jaw. Jedediah Vance was a man carved from the same stubborn rock as the unforgiving land he refused to abandon. His pride was a tall, unbending tree, but its roots were dying of thirst. He moved about his failing world in a heavy, proud silence, his inability to bend ensuring that he would, sooner or later, break. He would not speak of their dwindling funds, of the notes at the bank, or of the hard choices that lay ahead like stones in the road. His silence was an oppressive blanket, smothering the very air in the small ranch house. Inside, her mother, Mary, moved like a shadow, a woman whose constitution was never suited to the harshness of the West. She had grown frail and anxious, her worry a constant, fluttering thing like a trapped bird beating against a window pane. Her sighs were the soundtrack to their slow decline. And then there was Tom, her younger brother. At 12, he was a boy caught between the wonder of the open range and the palpable fear that seeped through the floorboards of their home. He was impressionable, his eyes wide, watching his father's stoicism and his sister's quiet strength, trying to piece together how a man was supposed to be in a world that seemed determined to crush them. The weight of it all, of her mother's fragility and her brother's future, settled on Ellie's shoulders, heavy as a winter coat in this relentless, burning summer. He arrived as the sun was bleeding its last fiery light across the horizon, turning the dust in the air to a haze of gold and crimson. He was a silhouette at first, astride a tired-looking buckskin, a man who seemed less to be riding over the land than to be a part of it, risen from the soil itself. He did not ride with the jangling swagger of most cowboys, but with a stillness that was somehow more commanding. Jedediah met him in the yard, his posture stiff, his hands hooked in his belt. Ellie watched from the porch, her mending forgotten in her lap. She could not hear their words, only the low murmur of voices, the sharp, clipped tones of her father and the deep, quiet rumble of the strangers. She knew who he was. Silas Blackwood. His name had been spoken in the town, a name passed around with a mixture of respect for his skill and a curl of the lip for his blood. Half white, half Native American. He belonged to no world and was therefore unwelcome in both. Hiring him was an act of pure, undiluted desperation. Jedediah had lost 2 hands in as many months, men who could see the writing on the wall and sought their fortunes elsewhere. The cattle were scattered, weak, and needed a man who could read the land and find what little grazing was left. Silas Blackwood, they said, could track a single steer across bare rock and gentle a horse with a whisper. Jedediah's pride warred with his pragmatism, and pragmatism, for once, had won a shallow victory. The disdain was still there, plain as day in the way her father did not quite look the man in the eye, in the way he kept a careful distance as they spoke. It was a negotiation that was also an insult. When it was done, Jedediah turned on his heel and stalked back to the house without a parting word, leaving Blackwood standing alone in the yard as twilight settled. The new hand swung down from his horse, his movements economical and fluid, not a single motion wasted. He was taller than she had first thought, lean but broad in the shoulders. He did not look toward the house, did not seem to seek any welcome. Instead, he led his horse toward the barn, his presence a quiet, disruptive stone dropped into the churning waters of the Vance family's desperation. He was an observer, his dark eyes seeming to take in everything, the cracked earth, the thin cattle, the very air of failure, without judgment, but with a deep, unsettling knowing. His purpose was a stark contrast to their frantic, flailing attempts to hold back the tide. It was as if he understood the rules of this hard land in a way they no longer did. The Vances owned a stallion, a magnificent beast of midnight black named Diablo. The name was well earned. He was all fire and fury, a creature of raw power and unpredictable temper. He was Jedediah's last great pride, a symbol of the prosperity they had once known. But his spirit was too big for their shrinking world, and his fear made him dangerous. A dry clap of thunder, a cruel joke from a cloudless sky, spooked him. The sound of his panicked screams and the crash of splintering wood brought everyone running to the corral. Diablo reared and plunged, his eyes white with terror, his powerful hooves striking sparks from the stones. He had shattered a section of the fence and was a breath away from breaking free and running himself to death on the plains. Jedediah shouted orders, his voice tight with panic. The two remaining hands, boys barely out of their teens, tried to approach with ropes, but the horse was a whirlwind of violent motion, driving them back. "Get a rope on him, blast it!" Jedediah roared, his face flushed, his authority crumbling in the face of the animal's sheer terror. Silas Blackwood emerged from the barn, drawn by the commotion. He did not run. He walked with that same steady, unhurried pace, his eyes fixed on the horse. He vaulted over the fence into the corral, landing softly in the dust. He held no rope, no whip. His hands were empty and open at his sides. "Stay back from him, Blackwood. He will kill you," Jedediah yelled. Silas paid him no mind. He moved in a slow, deliberate arc, never taking his eyes off the stallion. He began to speak, his voice too low for Ellie to make out the words, but the tone reached her, a low, calming murmur, like the sound of a steady river. It was not a command, but a conversation. Diablo stopped plunging, his body still trembling, his head high, ears swiveling to catch the sound. He watched Silas, snorting, his breath coming in ragged bursts. Silas stopped a dozen feet away, still murmuring. He sank slowly into a crouch, making himself smaller, less of a threat. He did not try to touch the horse. He simply waited, his patience a tangible thing in the tense air. Minutes stretched on, measured by the frantic beat of Ellie's heart. The stallion took a hesitant step, then another. He lowered his great head, his nostrils flaring as he tasted the man's scent on the air. Finally, with a shudder that ran the length of his body, he took the last few steps and nudged Silas's outstretched hand. Silas rose slowly, stroking the horse's sweat-slicked neck, his low voice a constant, soothing presence. The wild terror in the animal's eyes softened, replaced by a wary trust. Silas gently took hold of the broken halter and stood with him, a quiet picture of man and beast finding a place of calm in the chaos. Ellie had been holding her breath, her knuckles white where she gripped the top rail of the fence. As Silas turned, leading the now docile stallion toward the barn, his eyes found hers, across the dusty expanse, over the powerful back of the horse he had just tamed. Their gazes met and held. It was only for a moment, but it was a moment of profound, startling recognition. In his dark eyes, she saw not the pride of a man who had shown his worth, but something deeper, a shared understanding of wild things, of fear, and of the quiet strength it took to survive. It was a silent acknowledgement that thrilled her and terrified her in equal measure, a dangerous spark in a world as dry as tinder. Caleb Thorne rode a fine, blood-bay gelding and dressed in clothes that were too clean for the country he lived in. He was the wealthiest cattle baron in the territory, a man whose ranch spread across the valley like a conquering army, swallowing smaller homesteads one by one. He arrived at the Vance ranch a week after Silas, under the guise of a neighborly call. No one was fooled. A vulture does not call on a dying calf out of neighborly concern. He dismounted with a practiced ease, handing his reins to one of the two grim-faced men who rode with him everywhere. He was handsome in a severe, predatory way, with pale eyes that missed nothing and a smile that never quite reached them. He swept his hat from his head as he approached the porch where Jedediah stood, stiff and unwelcoming. "Jedediah," Thorne said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "A hard season." It was not a question. "We manage," Jedediah grunted, not offering a handshake. Thorne's gaze swept over the parched yard, the thin cattle, the weathered face of the house. He circled the property with a possessive air, as if he were already measuring it for new fences. "It takes a strong man to hold on in times like these," he continued, his words dripping with a condescending pity that was more insulting than any outright slur. A lesser man would have given up long ago. His eyes landed on Ellie as she stepped out of the house, a pitcher of water in her hand. His smile widened, and for the first time, it seemed genuine, though it made Ellie's skin crawl. "And Miss Vance, more lovely every time I see you. This harsh sun does not dare touch a beauty such as yours." The compliment was oily, invasive. He looked at her the way he looked at the land, as another asset to be appraised and acquired. He made his offer over the water she reluctantly served him. "I know things are tight, Jedediah," he said, his tone shifting to one of mock sincerity. "I am a businessman, but I am a neighbor first. I would be willing to take this place off your hands, pay you a fair price, more than fair, considering, enough to set you and your family up somewhere more forgiving. A place in town, perhaps." The offer was a profound insult, a suggestion that Jedediah Vance was no longer man enough to run his own ranch. It was also a threat, hanging unspoken in the air. "Take the offer, or I will take it all for nothing when the bank forecloses." "The Vance family does not run," Jedediah said, his voice low and tight with fury. "This land has been ours for 2 generations. It will be ours for 2 more. Thorne simply shrugged, his pale eyes glinting. "Pride is an expensive luxury, my friend. Think of your family. Think of your beautiful daughter's future." He let his gaze linger on Ellie again, a look that made her feel as if a physical claim had been laid upon her. He left soon after, his departure leaving a foul taste in the air, the dust settling on his final, chilling promise. "My offer stands. For now." The weight on Ellie's shoulders grew heavier. It was a crushing burden of duty to her family, a deep gnawing fear of Thorne's intentions, and now, a new and confusing pull toward the quiet man who worked in their midst. She watched Silas Blackwood from a distance. She saw him move with a purpose that was both graceful and powerful. She noticed the subtle intelligence in his dark eyes as he assessed a lame horse or scanned the horizon for a change in the weather. She saw the network of old, white scars on his knuckles, the silent story of a hard-brawled life. Most of all, she saw the way he was with the animals. He treated them with a respect no one else did, not even her father. He did not break their spirits. He earned their trust. He spoke to them in that same low murmur he had used on Diablo, a language of patience and understanding. In these quiet moments, watching him work, she began to see past the stoic exterior, past the wall he kept built around himself. She glimpsed the deep well of loneliness and pain he kept hidden, the solitude of a man who walked between 2 worlds and was welcome in neither. This confusing magnetism she felt was a dangerous current, pulling her away from the safe, familiar shore of her duty and toward an unknown and forbidden territory. Life on the ranch was a litany of backbreaking labor, mending fences under a sun that felt like a physical weight, the heat shimmering off the baked earth in waves, riding for miles in a constant, often fruitless, search for fresh grazing. The ever-present threat of the drought was a third hand on every tool, a constant ache in every muscle. To save what was left of their herd, Jedediah decided they had to drive the cattle 50 miles north to the high pastures in the foothills, where a late summer storm had left some grass. It was a grueling, desperate gamble. Ellie insisted on going, knowing they needed every able body. She rode alongside Silas, the dust of the trail coating their faces, the sun beating down. They barely spoke. Words were unnecessary, and in their world, dangerous. But in the long, hard days, a powerful current of understanding flowed between them. He would point to a subtle shift in the clouds, a sign of changing wind patterns invisible to her. She would see him stop his horse and dismount, digging with his bare hands at the base of a certain type of rock until a small, muddy seep of water appeared, enough to save a struggling calf. He taught her a new language, the language of the land itself, written in the bend of a blade of grass or the flight of a hawk. He did not speak of his heritage, but she knew this was its legacy, a knowledge deeper and older than any her father possessed. In their shared silence, surrounded by the vast, lonely landscape, their connection grew, a fragile green thing in a world of dust and drought. The tragedy, when it came, was born of the sky itself. One afternoon, the air grew thick and heavy, the color of old brass. A storm was building, but it was a dry storm, full of wind and electricity but no promise of rain. A single, jagged fork of lightning stabbed down into the parched prairie miles to the south, and in an instant, a plume of smoke rose against the horizon. The wind, hot and unforgiving, fanned the spark into a flame, the flame into a wall of fire that began to sweep north, directly toward them. Fear, acrid as the smoke, hit the ranch first. The sky turned a sickening orange-gray. The sound of the fire was a low, hungry roar that grew louder with every passing minute. Chaos erupted. Cattle bellowed in terror, chickens scattered, and Jedediah shouted frantic, useless orders. In the midst of the panic, Silas was an island of absolute calm. His voice cut through the noise, not loud, but sharp with authority. "Jedediah, get the women and the boy to the creek bed. Take the horses, now!" For once, Jedediah did not argue. He saw the focused intensity in Silas's eyes and obeyed. As Ellie scrambled to help her mother, she saw Silas organizing the two young hands, his movements swift and certain. He was not just reacting. He had a plan. It was the knowledge passed down from his mother's people, a wisdom born of surviving in this land for centuries. He sent the hands to drive the herd toward a wide, rocky patch of ground that would not burn, while he galloped toward the approaching fire line. Ellie watched in awe and terror as he rode back and forth, dragging a heavy, soaked cattle hide behind his horse, creating a desperate, hurried fire break. He worked with a relentless energy, a man battling an elemental force. He seemed to draw strength from the land itself, his body moving in perfect rhythm with his horse, both of them a single, focused entity against the backdrop of smoke and flame. He guided the last of the terrified animals to safety, his calm presence a beacon in the swirling ash and fear. The fire swept past them, a roaring beast that devoured acres of their pasture land and licked at the edges of their homestead, stopped only by the creek bed and the raw, black line Silas had scraped into the earth. The ranch was saved from complete devastation. But the cost was high. They lost dozens of cattle, and the fire had consumed the winter grazing they had been counting on. Their precarious hold had just become infinitely weaker. In the aftermath, the world was a monochrome of black and gray. The air was thick with the smell of ash and sorrow. Ellie found Silas alone by the barn, away from the others, kneeling in the smoky twilight. He was gently applying a salve to a burn on the leg of a small foal that had been separated from its mother. His own hands were blistered, raw from the heat and the work. Ellie approached quietly, carrying a bucket of fresh water and a small pot of the same calendula salve her mother used for burns. She set them down beside him. He looked up, his face smudged with soot, his eyes weary but clear. The barriers of race, of station, of her father's hatred, all seemed to burn away in the devastation around them, leaving only two people, stripped down to their essential selves. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick, the words wholly inadequate. "You saved us." He simply nodded, his gaze intense. He looked at her blistered hands, then at his own, and back to her face. In that single, lingering look, he conveyed more than words ever could, a shared pain, a fierce protectiveness, a depth of feeling that made her heart ache. This shared crisis, this trial by fire, had solidified the fragile bond between them. It was the true beginning of their dangerous, profound connection. When her father finally approached, he clapped Silas on the shoulder, a stiff, awkward gesture. "Damn lucky," Jedediah muttered, staring out at the blackened fields. "The wind must have shifted. Damn lucky." He attributed their salvation to luck, unable or unwilling to credit the skill of the man standing before him. The words were a slap, a deliberate refusal to see the truth. The rift of prejudice, deep and unyielding, remained. And in the smoky twilight, Ellie knew their troubles were far from over. They had only just begun. The season turned. Autumn arrived on the plains not with gentle grace, but with a sharp, crisp edge to the morning air and a fierce, melancholy beauty. The cottonwoods along the dry creek bed turned a brilliant, defiant gold, and the prairie grasses bleached to the color of old rust. The beauty was a lie, a lovely, painted mask hiding the face of the lean and hungry winter that was to follow. For the Vance family, the burnt-out pastures were a constant, black-toothed reminder of their vulnerability. The fire had taken more than grass and cattle. It had burned away the last of their meager financial reserves. Caleb Thorne seemed to sense this. His neighborly visits became more frequent, his fine horse a regular and unwelcome sight in their yard. The pretense of courtesy was wearing thin. His offers were no longer veiled suggestions but predatory demands, spoken with the chilling certainty of a man who knows he holds all the cards. He would sit on their porch, his pale eyes cataloging every sign of their decay, his presence a constant, suffocating pressure. And always, his gaze would return to Ellie, lingering with a possessive heat that made her feel marked, claimed. He spoke of the coming winter and the hardships it would bring, his words a slow, steady poison meant to erode her father's will. The daily rhythms of the ranch, however, provided a strange and secret antidote to Thorne's poison. The need to salvage what they could from the disaster forced Ellie and Silas into constant proximity. They spent long, sun-drenched days in the saddle, riding the vast, lonely range to round up cattle that had scattered for miles after the fire. They rode through silent, blackened landscapes and into hidden draws where patches of green still clung to life. The awkwardness that had once existed between them evaporated under the shared weight of their labor. Their silence was now a comfortable thing, a shared language that needed no words. It was in the way he would pass her a canteen without being asked, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second. It was in the small, grateful nod she would give him when he found a stray calf tangled in the brush and freed it with patient hands. An entire conversation could pass in a single, shared glance over the backs of the weary herd, acknowledgement of the day's hardship, respect for the other's endurance, and something more, a current of charged intimacy that flowed between them as surely as the wind. The vast, empty landscape became their sanctuary, a cathedral of sun and sky where the rigid, unforgiving rules of the world they lived in felt distant and small. One afternoon, as they were pushing the last few head of cattle homeward, the sky turned against them. The beautiful, crisp blue of the morning curdled into a bruised purple gray. A cold wind swept down from the mountains, carrying the scent of rain and ice. Within minutes, a sudden violent autumnal storm broke over them. It was not a gentle rain, but a driving horizontal deluge that soaked them to the bone in an instant and turned the dusty gullies into churning, muddy torrents. They were miles from the main house, the way back cut off by a newly raging flash flood. Silas, his face set against the stinging rain, pointed toward a low bluff. "There! An old line shack!" It was barely a shelter, a small, forgotten relic from a time when the ranch had been twice its size. The roof sagged and the wind whistled through the gaps in the log walls. But it was dry. Silas had a fire going in the small stone hearth in minutes, his movements sure and practiced. The small, sputtering flames pushed back the damp and the cold, casting flickering shadows on the cramped walls. The space was so small that they could not help but be close, their knees almost touching as they huddled by the fire. the storm raging outside. The intimacy they had so carefully avoided was now unavoidable. The pretense and the silence fell away, stripped from them by the cold and the shared danger. Huddled in the firelight, wrapped in their damp blankets, they began to speak. It was Silas who spoke first, his voice a low rumble beneath the drumming of the rain on the roof. He spoke of his childhood, offering her a rare and painful glimpse into the world that had shaped him. He told her of his mother, a Cheyenne woman with kind eyes and hands that knew how to heal. He spoke of her quiet strength and the stories she would tell him of the spirits of the land. Then he spoke of her death from a fever when he was just a boy, and of his white father, a trapper who had tried, in his own rough way, to raise him. But the world had no place for a boy like him. To the white settlers, he was a savage. To his mother's people, he was a stranger, the blood of their enemy in his veins. "I learned to walk alone," he said, his eyes fixed on the flames, the firelight catching the old pain in them. "I never belonged to either side of the river, so I learned to live in the river itself. The land, the animals. They do not care what blood you have. They only care if you are strong, if you are smart, if you respect them." He had found his only solace in the wildness of the land because it was the only place that had ever truly accepted him. Hearing the deep loneliness in his voice, a loneliness that mirrored her own, Ellie felt the last of her own walls crumble. She told him of her fears, of the suffocating weight of her family's future, of the way Thorn looked at her, as if she were a horse he was about to purchase. "I am terrified," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "Terrified he will get what he wants, that my father's pride will force him to sell the one thing he has left, me." In the flickering light of that small, forgotten shack, they were no longer a rancher's daughter and a hired hand. They were just a man and a woman, sharing the burdens of their pasts and the fears for their future. Their unspoken attraction, born of silent glances and shared hardship, was transformed, forged by the fire of their confessions into a deep and unbreakable emotional bond. Their connection, however deep and secret, did not go unnoticed. Town gossip was a weed that grew in even the poorest soil, and whispers about the rancher's daughter and the quiet half-breed hand began to circulate. It was enough to fuel the fire of Jedediah's own deep-seated bigotry. His suspicion of Silas hardened into open, undisguised hostility. He began to find fault in everything Silas did. He publicly berated him for using what he called savage tracking methods, reading a bent blade of grass, a single scuff on a stone, even when those methods brought back a lost steer that Jedediah's own efforts had failed to find. "That is not how a white man works the land," he would snarl, his voice full of contempt. Ellie found herself constantly in the position of defending Silas. "His ways work, father," she would argue, her voice quiet but firm. "He saved the herd. He saved the ranch." "He got lucky," Jedediah would retort, his eyes cold. "Do not mistake his heathen ways for skill." Each defense she made, each argument she won, only served to drive the wedge between her and her father deeper. A painful, ever-widening rift was forming in the heart of their family, and Silas was the unwilling stone that had been cast into their lives. Caleb Thorne, with his predator's instinct, sensed a rival. He saw the way Ellie's eyes would follow Silas, the subtle defiance in her posture when her father spoke ill of him. He decided it was time to put the hired hand back in his place. The opportunity came on a trip to town for supplies. Ellie had ridden in with her father and Silas. As Silas was loading sacks of flour into the wagon, Thorne and two of his thuggish ranch hands cornered him in the street. They blocked his path, their stances wide and arrogant. "Well, look what we have here," Thorne said, his voice carrying across the dusty street for all to hear. "Jedediah's pet. Tell me, boy, what sort of tricks does he have you doing out at that failing patch of dirt?" Silas said nothing, his face a mask of stone as he continued his work. Thorne's men laughed. "He is a quiet one, boss," one of them sneered. "Too good to talk to proper folk?" Thorne stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss, thick with insults aimed at Silas's parentage. words meant to provoke him into a fight he could not possibly win against 3 men. Ellie, who had been inside the mercantile, emerged just in time to see it. A white-hot fury, fierce and protective, rose in her chest. Before she even knew what she was doing, she was moving. She stepped directly between Thorne and Silas, her small frame trembling not with fear, but with rage. "Leave him alone, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice ringing out, clear and sharp in the sudden silence of the street. Townspeople stopped to watch, their faces a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. Thorne looked genuinely surprised, then amused. "Miss Vance, defending your father's property? How commendable." "He is a man, not property," she shot back, her chin high. "And he is a better man than you will ever be. You are a bully and a coward, hiding behind your money and your hired thugs." A collective gasp went through the small crowd. In their small, hierarchical community, a woman did not speak to a man like Caleb Thorne in such a way. It was an act of social suicide. Thorne's amusement vanished, replaced by a cold, reptilian fury. His eyes narrowed. Before he could speak, Silas put a firm hand on Ellie's arm. He looked directly at Thorne, his gaze steady and devoid of fear. "The lady is right," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight. "This is a conversation for another time." With quiet dignity, he gently pulled Ellie away, turning his back on Thorne and leading her to the wagon, diffusing the situation before it could explode into violence. But the lines had been drawn in the dust of that street for all to see. An early snow in the high country deepened the story's dark undertones. It drove the wild things down to the lowlands in search of food. One night, the thin, lonely howl of a wolf echoed across the ranch, answered by another, and then another. The sound was followed by the panicked, desperate bellowing of cattle. Jedediah jolted into action, organized a hunt at first light. Their efforts were clumsy, loud, and ineffective. They rode in circles, firing at shadows, succeeding only in scattering their already weakened herd even further. Silas did not join them. Acting on his own, he set out on foot, carrying only a rifle and a knife. Ellie, sick with worry, watched him disappear into the gray morning light. After a moment's hesitation, she saddled her mare and followed, keeping a safe distance. She tracked him for over an hour, finally finding him on a rocky ridge overlooking a narrow canyon. Below, the wolf pack was cornered. There were 5 of them, lean and gray, their eyes glowing. The pack leader, a large, dark male with a scarred muzzle, stood his ground, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Ellie watched, hidden behind a cluster of boulders, her heart pounding. She expected Silas to raise his rifle and begin shooting. He did not. He stood on the edge of the ridge, in plain sight, his rifle held loosely at his side. He was watching the alpha, studying him. It was not a mindless confrontation between man and beast. It was something more ancient, a tense and brutal negotiation. After a long, silent moment, Silas fired a single shot, not at the wolf, but into the rock just beside its head. The sound cracked through the canyon, and stone chips flew. The alpha flinched but did not run. Silas then let out a sharp, guttural cry, a sound of pure, primal dominance that seemed to shake the very rocks. The alpha stared for another long moment. Then, with a dip of its head that looked almost like a sign of respect, it turned and loped away, the rest of the pack melting into the landscape behind it. The confrontation was over. But as Silas turned to leave, one of the younger, more reckless wolves broke from the retreat and lunged at him from the side. Silas moved with lightning speed, turning to meet the attack. There was a blur of motion, the snarl of the animal and a grunt of pain from Silas. He threw the wolf off him, and it fled, yelping, after the others. He returned to the ranch an hour later, his face pale, a deep, bleeding gash torn in his left forearm. "Father will want the doctor," Ellie said, rushing to his side. "No," Silas said, his voice tight. "No doctor, no Jedediah." She understood. She led him to the quiet solitude of the barn, away from her father's judgmental eyes. By the low, golden light of a single lantern, she insisted on tending to the wound herself. She washed it gently with carbolic soap and water, her touch as light as she could make it. The gash was deep, ragged, and needed stitches. As she threaded the needle, her hands trembled. He put his good hand over hers to steady it. The simple touch was like a lightning strike, a shock that jolted through her entire body. It was a culmination of months of unspoken longing, of silent conversations and shared hardships. The air in the barn grew thick, heavy with everything they had never dared to say. She began to stitch the cut, her head bent low over her work, the scent of hay and horse and his own skin filling her senses. When she was done, she looked up. He was watching her, not with his usual stoic reserve, but with a raw, unguarded vulnerability she had never seen before. The wall he kept around himself was gone, and in his dark eyes, she saw a desperate, aching hope that was a perfect mirror of her own. The moment was fragile, beautiful, and fraught with a terrible peril. It was a silent confession, a promise, a point of no return. Outside, the first fat white flakes of winter began to drift down from a sky the color of lead, blanketing the scarred, burnt land in a pristine, deceptive beauty. The beauty of the snow masked a sense of impending doom. Caleb Thorne, enraged and publicly humiliated, was in town, plotting his revenge. Jedediah, blind to the real threat, saw only the man in his barn, the focus of all his anger and suspicion. Ellie and Silas, more deeply in love than ever, were trapped, isolated by a world that would never accept them. The harshest season was just beginning. Winter did not arrive. It descended. It came down from the mountains with a brutal, silent finality, burying the plains under a heavy blanket of white. The world shrank, its vast horizons drawn in and confined by a low, oppressive sky the color of dirty iron. The cold was no longer just a feeling. It was a physical presence, a relentless entity that seeped through the chinks in the farmhouse walls and crept into the hearts of those who lived within. It found every draft, every weakness, and settled deep in the bones. The isolation of the ranch became absolute. Days were short and gray, nights were long and black, filled with the sound of the wind howling like a hungry animal. The tensions within the Vance family, already stretched thin, now vibrated with a dangerous intensity in the close, suffocating quarters of the house. Jedediah's mood was as bleak and unforgiving as the weather. He moved through the rooms like a storm cloud, his silence a heavy, suffocating thing, his occasional pronouncements sharp and bitter as the frost. The financial strain was a constant, gnawing presence, a phantom guest at their meager dinner table. Caleb Thorne had ceased his visits with the first heavy snow, but his shadow loomed large. His threat was not gone, only dormant, a promise of a reckoning that would come with the spring thaw. For Ellie and Silas, the very harshness of the winter that imprisoned the others provided a strange and paradoxical kind of freedom. The relentless, demanding work of keeping the cattle alive became their secret world. Survival was a full-time occupation. Every morning before dawn, they would head out into the biting cold to break the thick sheets of ice that formed on the water troughs, their axes ringing out in the still, frozen air. They hauled heavy loads of hay through snow that was often waist-deep, their breath pluming in white clouds, their muscles aching with the strain. This endless, punishing labor necessitated that they work together, often alone and far from the disapproving eyes of the main house, and in these stolen moments, they found their only warmth. Huddled together for a minute's rest behind the shelter of a snowdrift, the wind tearing at their coats, a shared look would pass between them that spoke of more than the cold. In the quiet, steamy warmth of the barn at the end of a long day, surrounded by the soft sounds of chewing cattle, their bond deepened into something desperate and all-consuming. The love that had sparked in the summer sun and been forged in the autumn fire now became a burning, defiant ember against the crushing cold of winter. It was a dangerous, beautiful, and necessary thing, the only source of light in their shrinking world. The blizzard began as a whisper, a few idle flakes drifting from the gray sky. By late afternoon, it was a roar. The wind shrieked and tore at the house, and the snow became a solid, swirling white wall that erased the world. They were trapped, sealed inside the ranch as if in a tomb. The tension in the house was unbearable. Her father's dark mood, her mother's fretful sighs, and the rattling of the windows under the assault of the storm all combined to make Ellie feel as if the walls were closing in on her. She felt suffocated, her own despair a mirror of the blizzard outside. Needing a moment of peace, a breath of air that was not thick with unspoken misery, she pulled on her heavy coat and boots. "I am going to check on the animals," she said, her voice quiet. Her father grunted from his chair by the fire, not looking up. She slipped out the door and into the maelstrom. The wind nearly tore the breath from her lungs, and the snow blinded her. She fought her way to the barn, her landmark in the white chaos. Pushing open the heavy door and sliding it shut behind her, she was instantly enveloped in a world of profound stillness. The roar of the storm was muffled here, a distant, angry murmur. The air was warm and thick with the familiar, comforting smells of hay, animals, and leather. And he was there. In the center of the barn, a single lantern hung from a low beam, casting a pool of low, golden light. Silas sat on a stool within that circle of light, a piece of saddle leather in his lap, his hands methodically working a stitching awl. He was so completely absorbed in his work, he did not hear her enter. She stood for a long moment in the shadows, just watching him. Here, in this pocket of stillness he had created, he seemed at peace. The lines of strain on his face were softer in the lantern light. He was the calm at the center of the storm, both the one raging outside and the one that raged in her own heart. He must have sensed her presence. He stopped his work and looked up, his dark eyes finding her in the shadows. They did not speak. The silence in the barn was a living thing, heavy with everything they could not say. The longing that had been their constant companion for months was there, raw and undisguised on both their faces. The fear of her father, of Thorn, of the world that would never allow them to be together, was there too. And beneath it all was a profound hopelessness, a shared understanding that this love, their beautiful secret warmth, was a flame that was destined to be extinguished. Ellie moved from the shadows into the light, drawn to him as if by an invisible string. Her heart ached with a love that felt at once like her only salvation and her final curse. She stopped just before him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. He looked up at her, and the sadness in his eyes was so deep it threatened to break her heart. But beneath the sadness was a fierce, protective love for her that was unmistakable. He opened his mouth, his lips parting to form words she knew would be sensible, cautious. He would warn her away. He would tell her that this was impossible, that they had to stop before it was too late. He would speak of the danger, of the consequences. He would be noble and strong and break both their hearts with his reason. She could not bear to hear it. She raised a cold hand and gently pressed her fingers to his lips, silencing him before he could begin. "Don't speak, Cowboy," she whispered, her voice fast and desperate, barely more than a breath. "Don't speak." Before he could react, before the moment could be lost to reason, she leaned down and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was not gentle. It was a desperate, frantic collision born of months of repression and a profound, soul-deep need to connect. It was hunger and fear and hope and despair all crashing together in one searing, irrevocable moment. It was an act of pure, unthinking emotion, a blind leap into the abyss that sealed their fate. The world narrowed to this single point of contact, to the smell of leather and hay and the cold winter air still clinging to her coat, to the rough texture of his jaw beneath her hand and the startling warmth of his mouth. For a brief, stolen instant, there was no Jedediah, no Thorn, no family duty, no unforgiving world. There was only the two of them, a man and a woman, alone in the warm, lantern-lit darkness of the stable. They pulled apart, both breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. The ecstasy of the moment was immediately followed by a cold wave of terror. The reality of what they had done, of the line they had just crossed, came crashing down on them. He looked at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of wonder and dread, and she knew he felt it too. They had stepped off the cliff, and there was no turning back. But they were not alone. A small sound from the doorway made them freeze. Standing in the deep shadows of the barn entrance was her brother, Tom. He had followed her out, his boyish curiosity getting the better of him. His eyes were wide with a mixture of shock and confusion, his mittened hand half raised to his mouth. He did not understand the complexities of their love, the years of prejudice, the impossible weight of their situation. He only knew that he had seen his sister kissing the hired hand. He had witnessed something secret, something powerful, something forbidden. Before anyone could speak, before the tableau of stunned silence could break, the great barn door was thrown open with a violent crash. It slammed back against the wall, letting in a swirling vortex of snow and wind, and framed in the doorway, a dark, terrible figure against the raging white of the blizzard, was Jedediah Vance. He had come looking for his daughter. His face was a mask of disbelief that was already hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The scene he witnessed, his daughter, breathless and flushed, her hand still on the face of the half-breed hand in the intimate lantern light, confirmed every one of his deepest, ugliest prejudices. The explosion was instantaneous. "You!" The word was a roar of venom ripped from his throat. He lunged into the barn, his face contorted with hate. "You filthy animal! You get your hands off her!" He unleashed a torrent of vile, poison-laced words at Silas, accusing him of defiling his daughter, of using his heathen ways to corrupt her. Each word was a lash, fueled by years of bitterness and ingrained hatred. A dark and terrible madness took hold of him, blinded by fury. His eyes fell upon a pitchfork leaning against a stall. He seized it, its 3 sharp tines glinting in the lantern light, and lunged at Silas. Ellie screamed, a sound of pure terror, and threw herself between them. "No, Father, stop!" Silas reacted instantly. He did not raise a hand to fight back against her father. His only thought was to protect her. He spun her behind him, shielding her with his own body as Jedediah brought the pitchfork down in a wild, clumsy arc. Silas absorbed the glancing blow on his shoulder, grunting in pain but holding his ground, his arms a protective cage around Ellie. In the chaos, Tom let out a terrified cry, overwhelmed by his father's monstrous violence. His only instinct was to flee, to get away. He scrambled for the ladder that led to the hayloft, his boots slipping on the icy rungs. He was halfway up when his foot missed a hold. He cried out again, a short, sharp sound, and fell backward, landing on the frozen, hard-packed earth below with a sickening, unnatural crack. The violence stopped as if a switch had been thrown. The only sounds in the barn were the howling of the wind outside and Ellie's ragged, anguished cry as she tore herself from Silas's arms and scrambled to her brother's side. A horrified, ringing silence descended. Tom lay unconscious, his small body twisted, one leg bent at an angle that was horribly wrong. The tragedy, born directly from the revelation of their love and the poison of Jedediah's prejudice, shattered the world of the Vance family in an instant. Jedediah stared at his son's still form, the pitchfork falling from his numb fingers. The murderous rage in his eyes was extinguished, replaced by a dawning, soul-crushing horror. He was jolted from his fury into a state of profound shock and guilt. He looked from his broken son to Silas, his face a ruin of conflicting emotions. In the midst of this unimaginable horror, he needed someone to blame, a focus for his pain. "Get out!" he whispered, his voice a hoarse rasp. Then he roared, the sound full of grief and fury. "Get off my land!" He banished Silas, the man who had just protected his daughter, into the heart of the raging blizzard. Silas hesitated for a single, agonizing moment. His gaze was locked on Ellie's devastated face as she knelt beside her brother, her world crumbling around her. There was a universe of love and sorrow in that final look. Then, with his shoulders slumped in a posture of profound defeat, he turned and walked out of the barn, disappearing into the swirling white hell of the storm, leaving Ellie utterly alone to face the tragic consequences. The blizzard raged for 3 days and 3 nights, a relentless assault of wind and snow that buried the world. The Vance Ranch was entombed, locked away in a universe of suffocating white and howling silence. The storm was a physical manifestation of Ellie's own heart, a maelstrom of despair and isolation. Inside the farmhouse, the air was thick and heavy, each breath a struggle. Time seemed to have stopped, the rhythms of life frozen along with the landscape. Tom lay in his small bed, his leg crudely set and splinted with floorboards and torn sheets, the best Ellie could manage. He drifted in and out of a restless, fevered sleep, his moans a constant, low counterpoint to the shriek of the wind. The town, and its doctor, might as well have been on the other side of the moon. Her mother fluttered around the room, her hands twisting in her apron, her face a mask of helpless anxiety. Jedediah was a ghost. He was a hollowed-out man, the fire of his rage and pride extinguished by the cold, hard reality of his son's broken body. He moved silently through the house, his eyes vacant, his shoulders slumped under an invisible weight of guilt and grief. He did not speak of what had happened in the barn. He did not speak at all unless he had to. But the event hung in the air between him and Ellie, a thick, impassable wall of unspoken accusations and shared, bitter shame. The silence was louder than any argument, more painful than any blow. Ellie was trapped in a waking nightmare. Her days and nights blurred into a single, continuous cycle of tending to her brother. She bathed his hot forehead with cool cloths, forced sips of broth between his lips, and kept the fire fed, her hands always busy. But her mind was a captive, chained to a single, torturous loop of questions. Her thoughts were not in the sick room, but out in the storm, with Silas. Is he alive? The question echoed in the silence of the house, in the howling of the wind. Did he find shelter, or did he fall, lost in the white wilderness, to be buried by the indifferent snow? She tortured herself with images of him, his strong body giving in to the killing cold, his warm life freezing into stillness. The vast, snow-covered landscape that she had once seen as a sanctuary, a place of secret freedom with him, now felt like the walls of a prison. The profound silence of the plains echoed the silence in her own heart, a vast emptiness where his presence used to be. She felt utterly, terrifyingly alone, abandoned by the man she loved and alienated from the family she had tried so desperately to protect. He did not freeze. The knowledge that had been bred into him, the deep, instinctual wisdom of the land passed down from his mother, kept him alive. When Jedediah's roar had cast him out into the storm, Silas had turned his face to the wind and walked, not in panic, but with a grim, focused purpose. He did not fight the blizzard. He moved with it, using the contours of the land for shelter, his internal compass guiding him through the blinding chaos. On the second day, near starvation and coated in ice, he stumbled upon a remote trapper's cabin, long abandoned but with 4 solid walls and a roof that held. He spent a week there, letting the storm blow itself out, subsisting on the handful of dried beans he found in a rusted can. The glancing blow from the pitchfork had left a deep, ugly bruise on his shoulder that ached with a dull fire, but that wound was nothing. It was a shallow hurt compared to the gaping wound in his soul. He felt adrift, stripped of the one connection that had ever given his hard life meaning. The image of Ellie's devastated face as she knelt over her brother was burned into his memory, a constant, agonizing presence. When the skies finally cleared, he journeyed south, with no destination in mind, only a need to put distance between himself and the source of his pain. He took on odd jobs where he could find them, mending fences at a hardscrabble homestead, breaking horses at a sprawling ranch. But his reputation, or rather, the reputation of men with his blood, preceded him. He was met with suspicion at every turn. Men watched him with narrowed, hostile eyes. Women pulled their children close when he passed. He was offered the worst jobs for the lowest pay, and was always made to feel like an unwelcome intruder. The world seemed determined to remind him, over and over, that he did not belong. This constant, grinding rejection sparked something in him, It was no longer enough to simply endure. A deep, burning need began to grow, a need to understand the roots of the hatred that had defined his life, driven by this new purpose. He turned his horse toward the territories in the south, toward the bleak reservation lands where his mother's people had been forced to live after the last of the treaties were broken. It was a sorrowful place. The land was poor, the game was scarce, and the people were haunted by the ghosts of a lost way of life. He arrived not as a returning son, but as another stranger. His father's blood was plain to see in the set of his jaw and the color of his eyes. He was an outsider here, too, but there was a difference. Here, the suspicion was not mixed with contempt, but with a shared, deep-seated sadness. He found an old shaman, a man named Crow's Shadow, whose eyes were clouded with age but saw more than most. He had known Silas's mother as a girl, before she had left with the white trapper. He offered Silas a grudging acceptance, seeing the spirit of the mother in the son's quiet dignity. They spoke for many days by the shaman's small fire. Crow's Shadow did not offer easy answers or mystical visions. He spoke of history, of resilience, of the pain of being caught between two worlds. "The white man's world fears you because you carry the heart of the land within you," the old man said, his voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "Our world is wary of you because you carry the shadow of the white man in your face. You are not one or the other. You are both. This is not your weakness. The river that flows between two banks is stronger than either shore. You must learn to be the river, not the bank." Through these conversations, through listening to the old stories and confronting the ghosts of his own fractured past, Silas began to piece together the parts of his identity. He started to find a quiet strength, not in choosing a side, but in embracing the man he was, forged by the pain and love of both his parents. A man of the river. Back at the Vance Ranch, winter ground on with agonizing slowness. Their situation grew more dire with each passing week. With Silas gone, the endless work of the ranch was too much for the broken Jedediah and the two young hands. Fences fell into disrepair. Cattle, weakened by the meager feed, sickened and died. They were losing the war of attrition against the winter, one frozen calf, one empty sack of flour at a time. With the first thaw, when the snow began to melt and turn the world into a sea of mud, Caleb Thorne returned. He rode into their yard like a vulture circling its long-awaited prey. He saw the new depths of their desperation in the unmanned fences, in the gauntness of the remaining herd, and in the dark circles under Ellie's eyes. He saw Tom's injury as the final, perfect piece of leverage. He presented himself as their savior. He sat in their parlor, his fine coat unbuttoned, his manner oozing a false sympathy. He spoke of his concern, of his desire to help a neighbor in need. He offered to cover all of Jedediah's debts at the bank, to buy 100 head of new stock to replenish their herd, and, most importantly, to send for the best doctor in the territory to come and properly set Tom's leg to ensure the boy would walk again without a limp. The price for this salvation was simple: Ellie's hand in marriage. The proposal fell into the quiet room like a stone into a deep, dark well. Ellie was horrified, a cold dread spreading through her veins. She saw the trap for what it was, its steel jaws closing around her family. Her mother began to weep softly, not in protest, but in relief. To her, Thorne was not a predator. He was their only hope. "Ellie, think of your brother," she pleaded, her voice a thin, desperate whisper. Jedediah sat in his chair, his gaze fixed on the floor. He could not bring himself to look at his daughter, could not bring himself to force her hand, but his guilt-ridden, broken silence was a form of pressure in itself. It was a silent admission of his failure, a tacit acknowledgement that he could see no other way out. Ellie felt the weight of their survival settle squarely on her shoulders. She was trapped. Every path was a different kind of ruin. The fierce, desperate love she felt for Silas seemed like a distant, impossible dream from another lifetime. He was gone. He was likely dead. And her family was here, broken and failing before her very eyes. Her inner world became a prison of grief and impossible choices. In the dead of night, by the light of a single candle, she began to write. She filled page after page with long, desperate letters to Silas, letters she knew she could never send, letters that had no address. She poured out her love, her despair, her terror, and her undying hope onto the cheap, flimsy paper. The act of writing was her only release, the only way to keep from shattering completely. She wrote of Tom's accident, of her father's guilt, of Thorne's terrible bargain. She wrote of the way she still felt his kiss, a phantom warmth in the cold, lonely darkness. One afternoon, as the last of the snow was melting, leaving the land scarred and barren, she walked to a high, windswept bluff that overlooked the ranch. The world was a dreary canvas of brown and gray, as barren and broken as she felt. She clutched the bundle of unsent letters in her hand, the wind tearing at her hair and whipping the pages. She thought of letting them go, of scattering her words to the wind, a final admission of defeat. But she could not. She held them tight against her chest, a testament to a love that refused to die, even in the face of absolute hopelessness. Hundreds of miles to the south, Silas's journey had found its purpose. In a dusty saloon on the edge of the territories, seeking only a hot meal, he overheard a conversation between two disgruntled, hard-bitten men. They spoke a name that made his blood run cold: Caleb Thorne. He listened from the shadows as they spoke, their words fueled by cheap whiskey and a shared sense of grievance. They spoke of Thorne's illegal activities, of how he had systematically built his empire on the ruins of smaller men. They whispered of rustled cattle, their brands cleverly and expertly altered. They spoke of a diverted creek, a secret dam built high in the hills that had choked the water from half a dozen downstream homesteads, including their own, forcing them to sell to Thorne for pennies on the dollar. The words planted a seed in the barren ground of Silas's soul, a sliver of hope, a reason. It was no longer just about his own pain, his own lost love. It was about justice. It was about the man who had tormented Ellie, who had driven her father to the brink, who was now undoubtedly circling the Vance ranch like the vulture he was. His aimless wandering was over. His journey was no longer a flight from the past, but a march toward the future. The next morning, he traded his last few dollars for supplies. He turned his tired buckskin horse back to the north. A new, hard resolve had settled in his eyes. He was riding back toward the woman he loved, and toward the man he now knew he had to destroy. Spring came to the plains not as a gentle awakening, but as a muddy, chaotic mess. The thaw was a violent thing, turning the world into a raw, scarred landscape of sucking mud and swollen, roaring creeks. The melting snow revealed the blackened earth from the fire and the deep ruts of a hard winter, a land that seemed to mirror the emotional state of its inhabitants. At the Vance Ranch, the arrival of spring brought no relief, only a different kind of misery. The engagement between Ellie and Caleb Thorne was a grim, unspoken reality, a death sentence that had been passed but not yet carried out. Preparations for a wedding in June were underway, a funereal process that drained the last vestiges of light and hope from the small house. Her mother, seeing only the promise of financial salvation, bustled about with a bolt of white fabric, her talk of lace and ribbons a jarring counterpoint to the oppressive silence. Ellie moved through these days like a phantom, her spirit broken, her voice a hollow echo of its former self. She did as she was told, her compliance a form of surrender. Tom was recovering, his leg slowly mending, but the boy who had once been full of life was now sullen and withdrawn. He was burdened by the secret of what he had witnessed in the barn, a secret that festered in the silence, building a wall between him and the rest of his family. He would watch Ellie with haunted, accusing eyes, a constant, silent reminder of the love that had cost them all so dearly. But Silas had returned. He came not as a drifter seeking work, but as a changed man. The aimless wandering was gone, burned away by his journey and replaced with a hard-won sense of purpose. He did not ride into the Vance's yard. Instead, he made a hidden camp deep in the remote, wooded hills that overlooked the entire valley, a place where he could watch and wait, unseen. From this vantage point, he could see the Thorn Ranch, the Vance homestead, and the roads that connected them. His time away had sharpened him, giving his quiet patience a razor's edge. He began to move like a ghost through the territory. He sought out the other ranchers Thorn had ruined, the homesteaders who had been starved of water or had their cattle stolen. He found them in dusty saloons and remote cabins, broken men with bitterness in their eyes. He did not make grand speeches or promises. He simply listened, gathering their stories, piecing together the sordid pattern of Thorn's crimes. Slowly, he built a small, determined alliance of outcasts. There was a disgraced former lawman, a man named Peters, who had been run out of town for trying to investigate Thorn years ago. There were 2 Ute scouts, brothers who despised Thorn for encroaching on their ancestral lands and killing the game. And there were a handful of the ruined ranchers, men with nothing left to lose and a burning desire for justice. They were a small, ragged force, bound by a shared enemy, and Silas was their quiet, undisputed leader. Back at the ranch, Ellie sensed a change in the air, a low hum of tension that had nothing to do with her impending wedding. She saw Thorn's men riding patrols along the edges of the Vance property with more frequency. Their faces were harder than usual, their eyes constantly scanning the hills, their hands never far from their pistols. Thorn himself seemed more agitated on his visits, his smooth facade cracking with impatience. The predator was growing anxious. One clear afternoon, needing to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the house, Ellie went for a long ride, pushing her mare toward the remote northern edge of their property. As she rode through a small grove of aspens, something caught her eye. It was a carving in the smooth, white bark of a tree, fresh enough that the wood beneath was still pale. It was not a name or a random mark. It was a symbol, a small circle with a single, straight line drawn through it, pointing west. Her breath caught in her throat. Silas had shown it to her once, on that long-ago cattle drive. It was a symbol his mother's people used to mark a safe path, a sign of passage. Her heart, which she thought had turned to stone in her chest, gave a powerful, painful leap. A wild, terrifying hope surged through her, so potent it almost made her dizzy. He was alive. He was here. He was close. That small carving on a tree was enough to reawaken her fighting spirit. The phantom that had been drifting through the farmhouse vanished, and the old Ellie, the one with quiet strength and a core of steel, returned. The despair that had paralyzed her was replaced by a cold, clear-headed resolve. She began to subtly sabotage Thorn's plans. She feigned a sudden, lingering illness, a woman's malady that was vague enough to be unprovable but serious enough to postpone any talk of finalizing the wedding date. The delay frayed Thorn's nerves further, a small victory that fanned the flames of her defiance. She started observing the movements of Thorn's men, noting their patrol times, their habits. She found a second symbol carved into a fence post near the old line shack where she and Silas had taken shelter from the storm. Tucked into a hollow at the base of the post was a small, tightly folded piece of paper. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The note was brief, his handwriting as sparse and economical as his speech. "I am here. Be careful. Be strong." She left a reply, her heart pounding with a mixture of love and fear, telling him of Thorn's impatience and the wedding. A clandestine communication began. They became conspirators, leaving messages for each other in a series of dead drops, their notes filled with fragments of information, words of encouragement, and a renewed sense of shared purpose and desperate love. They were no longer just victims of circumstance, caught in a tragic story. They were fighting back. The tension on the plains stretched tighter and tighter, like a wire about to snap. Thorn, growing paranoid and feeling his control slipping, decided he could wait no longer. Ellie's continued delays, coupled with a growing sense of being watched, pushed him to force the issue. He would break the Vances completely, leave them with absolutely nothing, so that Ellie would have no choice but to crawl to him, utterly and completely dependent on his charity. He devised a devastating blow, a final act of cruelty to be disguised as a tragic accident. He gathered a few of his most ruthless men. The plan was simple and brutal. They would gather a herd of wild longhorns that roamed the northern range, drive them into a frenzy, and stampede them directly through the heart of the Vance's property. The thundering herd would trample what was left of Jedediah's cattle and obliterate his fences, the final symbols of his pride. It would be an act of God, a prairie tragedy that no one could blame on Caleb Thorne. The plan went horribly wrong. In the weeks since his son's accident, Jedediah had taken to spending his days alone, out on the range. It was a form of penance. He worked tirelessly, mechanically, trying to mend the fences that had fallen into disrepair over the winter. With a painful, bitter irony, he found himself drawn to the sections that Silas had built, the posts still strong and the wire still taut. He was out there, his back to the north, hammering a loose staple into a post, when the ground began to tremble. From their camp in the hills, Silas and his allies saw the dust cloud first, a rising brown plume on the horizon. They saw Thorne's men, small figures on horseback, pushing the herd, aiming it like a weapon. They saw the danger instantly, but they were too far away. They leaped onto their horses, riding desperately, shouting warnings that were swallowed by the wind and the rising roar. They could not stop the inevitable. Jedediah turned, his face a mask of confusion. As the roar grew louder, he saw the wave of horns and hooves and dust cresting the hill, a living avalanche of flesh and fury thundering directly toward him. He was frozen for a fatal second, a lone, frail figure in the path of a force of nature. The stampede was not a clean or merciful thing. Jedediah was not killed outright. He was caught on the edge of the herd, struck, and thrown like a rag doll. He was trampled, his body broken and battered by the passing hooves, and then left behind as the river of panicked cattle flowed on, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. The earth fell silent again. The dust began to settle, and Jedediah Vance lay bleeding and broken under the vast, indifferent sky. Silas was the first to reach him. He swung down from his horse, his face grim. Jedediah was alive, but barely. His clothes were torn. His body was a canvas of deep cuts and dark bruises, and one of his legs was twisted at a sickening angle. Silas knelt beside the man who had banished him, the man who had tried to kill him, and gently felt for a pulse. It was there, a faint, thready flutter. Without hesitation, he gathered the proud old man into his arms, lifted his broken body, and carried him to his horse. The ride back to the Vance ranch was a slow, agonizing journey. Silas, with Jedediah draped unconscious before him, crossed the threshold of the property from which he had been so violently cast out. It was a powerful, symbolic return, not as a hired hand, but as a savior. The sight of Silas riding into the yard, carrying the battered and unconscious form of her father, shattered Ellie's world all over again. She ran from the porch, a cry of anguish tearing from her throat. The hatred, the prejudice, the shame, the fear, all of it was washed away in the tidal wave of this new tragedy. There was no white man, no half-breed, no forbidden love. There was only her father, broken and perhaps dying, and the man who had brought him home. Together, they carried Jedediah inside and laid him on his own bed. They worked side by side, their movements synchronized by urgency and a deep, unspoken understanding. Ellie cleaned his wounds while Silas, his hands surprisingly gentle, set the broken bones of his leg as best he could. The proud old rancher drifted in and out of consciousness, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. In one of his lucid moments, his pain-filled eyes flickered open. He saw his daughter's tear-streaked face, and he saw Silas, holding a compress to a deep gash on his forehead. A moment of terrible, heartbreaking clarity seemed to dawn in his gaze. He saw Silas not as a savage, not as a rival, but as the man who had tried to save him, the man his daughter loved, the man whose quiet strength he had so foolishly and hatefully rejected. His lips, cracked and bloody, moved. His voice was a broken, raspy whisper. barely audible. He looked at Ellie, but his words were for both of them. "Forgive me." It was a plea, a confession, an act of surrender. It was the final relinquishing of his pride, a moment of profound, heartbreaking reconciliation that cost him the very last of his strength. With those two words, the walls between them finally crumbled to dust. This event was the final catalyst. Ellie's sense of obligation to her family was transformed. She was no longer bound by her father's pride. She was now fueled by a fierce, burning desire for justice for what had been done to him. The charade of her engagement to Thorne was over, shattered by the thunder of the stampede. It was replaced by an unbreakable, unspoken alliance with Silas. That evening, as Silas stood watch on the porch, Ellie went to her father's room. She opened the old wooden chest at the foot of his bed and took out his rifle, a heavy, well-oiled Winchester. She felt its solid weight in her hands. It was no longer her father's weapon to command. It was hers to wield. Her face, pale in the lamplight, was set with a grim, cold determination that her mother would not have recognized. She walked out onto the porch and stood beside Silas. They did not touch, did not speak. They simply stood together, two solitary figures looking out at the ruined land and the darkening sky. They were no longer just lovers in hiding, no longer victims of fate. They were a united front, and they were ready for the final confrontation. The days that followed the stampede were filled with a tense, fragile quiet. Jedediah Vance lay in his bed, a man shattered in body and spirit. He was alive, but the proud, unbending man he had once been was gone, replaced by a broken figure who drifted in and out of a pain-filled haze. His whispered apology hung in the air of the small farmhouse, an invisible, powerful thing. For Ellie, it was a release, a painful and long-overdue freedom from the weight of his stubborn pride. She was no longer just a daughter bound by duty. She was a woman who had been set free to choose her own path. The community buzzed with the news of the tragic accident. Sympathy was offered, along with covered dishes and hushed whispers about the Vances' string of bad luck. But Ellie and Silas knew the truth. They knew it was not luck, but malice, that had broken her father and ruined their land. The fragile alliance Silas had built in the hills was ready. They were armed not just with rifles, but with the undeniable proof of Caleb Thorne's culpability, and they were ready to act. The confrontation was not a simple shootout at high noon. It was something far more dangerous, a calculated and public unraveling of an empire built on deceit. The next morning, Ellie rode into town. She was not the demure, troubled rancher's daughter the townspeople knew. She was a woman forged in fire and grief, her face set with a cold resolve that turned heads as she passed. She did not go to the mercantile or the doctor's office. She went directly to the sheriff, a portly man named Blevins who had long grown comfortable and well-fed in Thorne's pocket. She found him in his office and closed the door behind her. She laid her father's rifle on his desk. "There was a stampede at my father's ranch yesterday," she said, her voice even and devoid of emotion. "It was no accident. It was Caleb Thorne." The sheriff sputtered, his face turning red. "Now, Miss Vance, you cannot make such accusations." "I am not accusing," Ellie cut him off. "I am telling you a fact, and now I am presenting you with a choice. You can uphold the law you swore an oath to and arrest him, or you can do nothing. And if you do nothing, I will stand in the street and tell every soul in this town how you have been taking Thorne's money for years to look the other way. You will either be a lawman, or you will be exposed as his accomplice. The choice is yours." She left him sweating and speechless. At the same time, Silas and his allies were making their own moves. They did not go to the sheriff. They went to the true heart of the town. Peters, the disgraced ex-lawman, laid out the evidence of water theft to the blacksmith and the livery owner. Men who understood the value of water better than anyone. The Ute brothers spoke to the stable hands and the freighters, men who knew the land and had seen Thorne's men where they should not have been. And Silas. He went to the ruined ranchers, bringing them forward to tell their stories to the town's preacher and the mercantile owner, men whose moral and financial influence held the community together. They were building a case not in a courtroom but in the court of public opinion. cornered and exposed. Thorn did not surrender quietly. He strode into the center of town, his face a mask of performative outrage, his loyal men fanning out behind him. He found Ellie standing before the hotel and raised his voice for all to hear. "What is this madness?" he boomed, projecting an air of wounded authority. "These lies, spread by a hysterical woman whose family is cursed by failure. She was promised to me, and now that her father has had another unfortunate accident, she seeks to blame me for her troubles." He turned his attention to Silas, who stood with his allies at the edge of the growing crowd. "And this is her source. A half-breed outlaw, a drifter who has poisoned her mind against me." The town became a stage for a tense showdown of wills. The crowd murmured, their loyalties torn. Thorn was wealthy, powerful, a white man of standing. The accusations came from a woman on the edge of ruin and a collection of outcasts. For a long, terrible moment, it seemed that the town's ingrained prejudice would win out, that the people would choose the familiar comfort of the established order over the uncomfortable, messy truth. The turning point came from the most unexpected source. A small wagon had pulled up at the edge of the crowd, driven by Ellie's mother. In the back, propped up on pillows, was Tom. His face was pale and thin, but his eyes, for the first time in months, were clear and fiercely determined. Having seen his father nearly killed, having understood the true nature of the man who had terrified his family, he had finally found his voice. "He is lying." The voice was not loud, but it was clear and carried in the sudden hush. Every head turned to the boy in the wagon. Tom looked directly at Thorn, his small chin held high. "He is a liar and a bully. I saw him. I heard him. He was always threatening Pa, always saying he would take our ranch. He said he would take my sister." He then looked at the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the familiar faces of his neighbors. "The night my PA got mad in the barn, it was because we were all so scared of him, of Mr. Thorn. He made my PA crazy with worry. He is the reason I fell. He is the reason my PA got hurt yesterday. It is all his fault." He did not offer evidence or legal arguments. He spoke the simple, undeniable truth of a child, and that truth, in its raw honesty, was more powerful than all of Thorn's blustering and all the town's prejudice. It broke the spell of fear and authority that Thorn had held over the community for so long. A murmur went through the crowd, but this time it was different. It was the sound of a tide turning. Realizing he had lost, that the faces staring back at him were no longer cowed but filled with a dawning contempt, Thorn made a last, desperate move. He lunged for Ellie, intending to grab her, to use her as a shield to escape. But Silas had been watching his eyes, anticipating his move. He moved with a speed that was both fluid and absolute, intercepting Thorn before he could reach her. The confrontation was not a heroic duel. It was a short, ugly, desperate struggle. Thorn threw a wild punch, which Silas deflected. As they grappled, a raw fury, born of 100 injustices, erupted from the crowd. It was not Silas who brought Thorn down. It was Peters, the ex-lawman, who tackled him from the side. It was the ranchers Thorn had ruined who grabbed his arms and legs, dragging him down into the dust he had forced them to eat for so long. Justice was served, but it was messy and unsatisfying. There was no clean shot, no heroic victory. There was only a desperate, pathetic man being subdued by the collective weight of the very people he had victimized. Thorn was locked away in the sheriff's jail. His empire of deceit crumbled to dust, but the deep wounds of prejudice, greed, and violence remained etched on the face of the community. In the weeks that followed, as a fragile spring finally took hold of the land, a new, harsh reality set in for Ellie and Silas. Thorn was gone, but they were not welcomed as heroes. They were regarded with a quiet suspicion and an uncomfortable awe. Ellie, for having stood against a powerful man and for having so openly chosen a man like Silas, had crossed a social line from which she could never fully return. The women of the town were polite, but distant. She was no longer one of them. And Silas, despite having been the agent of their liberation, would always be an outsider. He was respected for his strength, but his blood would forever mark him as different. They had won the battle, but they both understood they could not win the war against the ingrained hatred of the world they lived in. They could not build a life here. There were too many ghosts, too many memories, too many invisible walls they would never be able to tear down. Their decision was bittersweet, but it felt right, necessary. The Vance Ranch, though saved from Thorn, held too many specters of their pain. One evening, as Jedediah sat propped up in a chair on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky, they told him their plan. He was recovering slowly, a quieter, wiser man, the hard shell of his pride permanently shattered. He looked from his daughter's determined face to the quiet strength in Silas's eyes, and he nodded, a profound sadness and acceptance in his gaze. He gave them his blessing, his final act of atonement. "A man ought to be judged by his heart, not by his name or his kin," he said, his voice a rough whisper. "I was a fool not to see that. Go, find a place where the world sees that too." He would remain on the ranch with Tom, to heal and to rebuild what they could. The final scenes of their life on the ranch were quiet and poignant. They packed a single, sturdy wagon with their few possessions, some tools, a sack of flour, a handful of books, the clothes on their backs, and Ellie's box of unsent letters. Their farewell to Jedediah and Tom was emotional, but it was not a scene of sorrow. It was filled with a sense of peace, of a difficult chapter finally coming to a close. The story closes with an image etched against the setting sun. Ellie and Silas ride their horses, side by side, the wagon with its canvas top glowing in the golden light trailing behind them. They are heading west, away from the ghosts of their past, toward a horizon that is vast, challenging, and unknown. There is no guarantee of an easy life waiting for them, no promise of a perfect happiness. They carry the scars of the tragedies they endured, scars that will never fully fade, but they have each other. Their love, tested by prejudice and forged in the crucible of profound loss, is a resilient and powerful force, a quiet strength that will be their compass and their anchor. The final lines of their story are not a fairy tale ending written in the stars, but a single, hard-won glimmer of hope, a testament to their survival, and the enduring promise of a new beginning in the untamed heart of the American West. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.